You feel like you're doing everything right, and still nothing moves. It's not a lack of information. It's not a lack of will. It's something else, something that keeps operating underneath everything you try. And you feel it, even when you can't name it. There is a mechanism that most people never stop to observe. Not because it's hard to find, but because they're too busy trying to fix the symptom without ever reaching the cause. Procrastination is the most visible symptom of that mechanism. But it's not the problem. It never was. And that's why every technique you've tried worked for a while, and then the gravity came back silent as always. Think about what happens when you're stuck. There's a weight. There's the task. There's a distance between the two that seems reasonable to cross, but that in practice you never cross. And then comes the second layer, the analysis. Why am I not doing this? What's wrong with me? How do other people manage it when I can't in the same way? And it's in that second layer where most of the real damage happens. Because now you're not just procrastinating, you're procrastinating and thinking about procrastinating, using energy to monitor the energy that's missing, building a structure of attention that feeds exactly what you're trying to solve. It's a closed circuit, and the exit is not inside the circuit. Daniel spent years observing this pattern, not just in other people but in his own mind. And what became clear after enough time of honest observation is that the effort to change behavior without changing the state that generates the behavior is, at best, inefficient. And most of the time counterproductive. Because the more force you apply against a pattern, the more that pattern consolidates itself as the central problem of your life. It gains weight. It gains narrative. It gains identity. And identity is the level where things truly get stuck. There is a difference between having a behavior and being that behavior. It seems subtle when you read it, but in the internal structure of the mind, that difference is enormous. When you have a behavior, it's an action you can observe from the outside. When you are that behavior, it becomes part of what you believe you are, and the mind will defend that with the same ferocity it uses to defend any other part of identity. Not by conscious choice, by structural efficiency. The mind that believes it is a procrastinator doesn't need to deliberate when procrastination appears. It already knows the script. It has already rehearsed the ending. The body, which is faster than conscious thought, has already begun executing the familiar response before you realize you were choosing. And this is where most approaches fail systematically. They enter after the pattern is already in motion, after the identity has already taken control. And they try to redirect behavior with behavioral tools, lists, timers, rewards, symbolic punishments, public commitments. These tools have value. Daniel isn't saying they're useless, but they operate at the wrong layer to produce lasting change. They are surface interventions applied to a structural problem. And structure doesn't change through repeated behavior. It changes when the internal state that generates the behavior changes. Behavior is the shadow of the state. You can chase the shadow your entire life without ever touching the object that casts it. Ko was 29 years old and had worked in design for 6. Good at what he did, recognized by clients, and completely unable to start personal projects. The ones that would be his, made for him without an external deadline. He had a notebook with ideas dating back 3 years. He'd open the file, stare at the blinking cursor, and close it, always with a valid reason. The brief wasn't clear enough, the mood wasn't right, there were other more urgent things. Real reasons. Internally consistent logic. On a Wednesday morning, without ritual, without a grand decision, he stopped trying to start. Not as surrender. He simply stopped negotiating with the thought that said he wasn't ready. He placed his hands on the keyboard, breathed slowly, and sat with the discomfort of not knowing where to begin, without trying to resolve that discomfort, without fleeing it, without turning it into one more analysis. He simply let it be there. 12 minutes later, he was working, not because the discomfort had vanished, but because he had stopped using energy to resist it. That wasn't technique. It was a shift at the level of state. State precedes everything. That is the central observation Daniel wants to build here, with enough clarity that it doesn't remain abstract. When the mind is in tension, in active resistance mode, in internal conflict between what it wants and what it believes it deserves, between what it plans and what it believes it will execute, it produces a specific type of attention. Narrow, circular, reactive. That type of attention perceives obstacles more clearly than paths. It amplifies what isn't working. It creates urgency where there is no real urgency and paralysis where there is enough space to act. And every decision made from that state carries the signature of the state. Even when the decision seems rational, even when the list is made and the plan is clear, the state contaminates the execution before it begins. Internal frequency is not a poetic metaphor. It is the operational quality of the mind at a given moment. And that quality determines what you perceive as possible, and what you perceive as possible determines which actions you consider, and the actions you consider determine the results you create. It is a chain system, and it begins at the state, not at the action. Changing the action without changing the state is rearranging furniture in a room that's on fire. When the state changes, the actions change with it, without the friction, Not because it became emotionally easier, but because the internal conflict that generated the friction was resolved at the source, not suppressed at the surface. Here is where the reasoning needs to become more precise, because this is where the confusion usually appears. Changing the state doesn't mean producing a positive state. It doesn't mean getting motivated, getting excited, manufacturing artificial enthusiasm. That is another form of tension with inverted polarity. The state Daniel is describing is not positive or negative. It is neutral. It is the neutral field, the absence of identity being defended, the absence of narrative being sustained, the absence of effort to be different from what one is in this moment. 0 point is not euphoria. It is absolute silence as operational structure. And within that silence, without the pressure of having to be productive, without the guilt of not having been, without the comparison to whoever seems more functional, the mind begins to operate in a qualitatively different way. Not dramatically, not instantly, but different enough that the action which previously had to be negotiated, convinced, pushed against invisible resistance, simply appears, with less weight, with less internal negotiation, with a clarity you recognize immediately because it is completely different from forced clarity. It's not ecstasy, it's simply knowing what to do and doing it. But how does one access this neutral field? That is always the question that appears here. And Daniel will answer directly, without creating a 7-step system or a methodology with a proper name. Access begins with stopping trying to access. That is real paradox, not rhetoric. Most people searching for different internal states are searching with the same tense mind they're trying to transform. And that tense mind brings into the search all of its characteristics: urgency, expectation of results, constant evaluation of whether it's working, comparison with how it should be. And so the search for the neutral state becomes just another form of tension. The neutral field is not reached. It is revealed when what was obscuring it stops operating. What obscures it is the constant narrative of identity. The thought that tells you who you are, what you deserve, what is going to happen, what will probably go wrong again this time. That narrative flow doesn't need to be eliminated, that is impossible and not the goal. But it can be observed. And genuine observation creates distance. Not the distance of someone who dissociates, but the functional distance of someone who perceives that they are the observer of thought, not the thought itself. That moment of perception, which can last seconds, is the moment when the neutral field opens. Not as a place you go to, as the absence of where you were. The identity that procrastinates has a sophisticated internal logic. It isn't irrational. It is highly rational within its own parameters. It has a story about why the conditions are never quite right. A theory about how you function better under pressure. A narrative about how perfectionism is actually a high standards pattern and not a way of avoiding judgment of incomplete work. It has answers for everything, and the answers are intelligent. That is what makes the pattern so resistant. It isn't a simple habit. It is a structure of meaning. And structures of meaning behave like immune systems. They reject what they perceive as a threat to internal coherence. When you try to change by force, the identity rejects. When you try to change by persuasion, the identity counter-argues with the same intelligence you used to try to convince it. When you try to change through guilt, the identity uses the guilt as one more piece of evidence that you are the type of person who doesn't change, and reinforces exactly what you were trying to dissolve. The only entry the identity has no way to defend against is observation without agenda. Because it isn't a threat. It isn't trying to change anything. It is simply present, seeing what is happening, without the judgment that normally triggers the defense. And that is precisely what is disarming, not as strategy, but as the natural effect of honest observation. There is a concept Daniel wants to introduce here because it explains the mechanism in a way that motivational language has never managed to: internal coherence. The human mind does not seek happiness as its primary function. It seeks coherence. It needs what you think, what you believe, what you do, and what you obtain to be aligned in a narrative that makes sense. When there is incoherence between these levels, when you want one thing, believe you deserve another, act in a third way, and obtain a fourth result, the mind experiences this as noise. And noise produces more tension. And more tension produces more incoherence. The system spirals. Here is the piece of information that changes everything. The mind will resolve the incoherence. Always. The question is how. It can resolve through change, adjusting belief, behavior, and result until they are aligned. But that requires the internal state to allow that change. If the state is in collapse, the mind doesn't have the operational space to process real change. So it resolves the incoherence the only way it can, by adjusting perception. It begins to perceive the evidence that confirms you are the type of person who doesn't act, who doesn't complete things, who needs perfect conditions that never arrive. Not because you are that way, but because this resolves the incoherence in the only place where the mind has access. The story you tell about yourself. And when the story solidifies, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Not by magic, by attentional selection. You perceive what confirms what you already believe. You interpret what doesn't confirm it as exception or accident. And the pattern deepens, invisible, functioning as always. The moment of interruption of this cycle is not dramatic. It is not an epiphany. It is not a morning where everything suddenly makes sense and you never procrastinate again. It is much quieter than that. It is the moment when you stop, in the middle of yet another cycle of resistance, and genuinely ask, what is the state that is present right now? Not as analysis, not as one more level of monitoring, but as genuine observation. Without the rush to correct what you find, without the expectation that observing should already produce immediate transformation. Just what is here. And when you find tension, when you find the urgency to prove something, the fear of what the incomplete work says about you, the belief that the next project will be the one that finally works, you don't fight against it. You name it. You acknowledge it. You allow it to be there without needing to resolve it right now. That is what creates the space, not the solution, the honest recognition before any attempt at solution. And in that space, which can be 1 second, can be 5 minutes, can be a state you begin to access more consistently over time, the action that previously required all that internal negotiation begins to happen with less friction. Not because you became a different person, but because the structure that generated the friction is no longer active in the same way. There is a second layer in this mechanism worth observing carefully, because this is where most people who understand the theory still get stuck in practice. Even when you understand that state precedes behavior, there is the temptation to use that understanding as one more technique. You try to produce the neutral state in the same way you used to try to produce productivity, with effort, with monitoring, with constant evaluation of whether you're getting there. And the effort to produce the neutral state is, by definition, the opposite of the neutral state. It is tension trying to become the absence of tension. It is identity trying to dissolve identity. That doesn't work. And realizing it doesn't work can be frustrating in a particular way, because now you understand the mechanism and still can't access it, which can create a new layer of incoherence. Why do I understand this and still nothing changes? The answer is that intellectual understanding and state change are different things. Understanding is the map. The state is the territory. You can memorize the map with extraordinary precision and still be completely disoriented in the territory. What moves you from map to territory is the practice of observation, not as intellectual exercise, but as direct experience. It is the difference between thinking about the neutral field and being in it for an instant, even briefly, even imperfectly, because the nervous system learns through direct experience, not through conceptual understanding. And every time you access the neutral field, even for seconds, you are creating an internal reference point, a memory of what that state feels like. And that memory becomes progressively more accessible, not because you became more disciplined, but because the system learned a path that previously didn't exist. Frequency, in the context this video proposes, is the operational quality of the internal state over time. It isn't something you adjust once and keep fixed. It is something that oscillates, and the question is not to eliminate the oscillation, but to develop the capacity to notice when you've moved out of alignment and return without drama. Because you will. You always will. The tension comes back. The old pattern will appear. There will be days when resistance is stronger than clarity. That is not failure. That is the normal functioning of a system in the process of reorganization. What changes over time is not the absence of oscillation. It is the speed of return, and the capacity to return, to recognize the state of collapse without identifying with it, to observe procrastination without becoming the procrastinator. That capacity is what Daniel is describing as frequency adjustment. It's not adjusting to a fixed state and remaining there. It's developing the fluency to recognize where you are and move with less resistance back to 0 point. This is not a productivity technique. It is education of the internal state. There is a final observation about procrastination that Daniel wants to make because it completely changes the relationship with the pattern. Procrastination, in most cases, is not avoiding work. It is avoiding judgment. It is avoiding the moment when the work is done, and therefore can be seen, evaluated, judged as insufficient. While the work isn't done, the protection of potential exists. The version that lives in the mind can still be perfect. can still be everything you imagined. The unfinished project carries the promise that one day, under the right conditions, you will produce something equal to what you believe it should be. Finishing destroys that protection. So procrastination is not the absence of action. It is a sophisticated form of self-preservation. It is the mind protecting the identity from a judgment it anticipates as devastating. When you see this clearly, when you realize you're not avoiding the task, but avoiding what the completed task might reveal about you, something shifts. Not because the fear disappears, but because it loses its invisibility. And what can be seen can be observed. And what can be observed can be put in perspective. Because here is what the tense mind can never see clearly. The judgment you anticipate with such precision rarely happens the way you imagine it. And even when it does, even when the work isn't as good as the version that existed in your mind, the real cost of finishing something imperfect is dramatically smaller than the accumulated cost of never finishing anything. Unrealized potential has a weight that grows over time. The imperfect but existing project has a weight that shrinks. The mind at 0 point can see this. The tense mind cannot, because it is too busy constructing the scenario of the worst possible judgment as a way of preparing for it. So what do you do with this? Not a list, not a protocol. One observation. The next time you notice procrastination in motion, not retrospectively, but in the moment while it's happening, pause. Not to analyze, not to create a better plan, just to notice the state that is present. With the same curiosity you would have if you were observing someone else. Without the urgency to correct. Without the judgment that this shouldn't be happening. Just what is here. And then, without waiting for the state to change, without needing it to change in order to begin. Not because you're ready, but because the act of starting from the state that is present, without demanding that the state be different first, is exactly what interrupts the cycle that required perfect conditions to exist. You don't wait for the right frequency to begin. You begin, and the beginning, made from honest observation instead of forced resistance, starts to adjust the frequency. The causality is inverted. It is not the perfect state that produces the action. It is the action from the honest state that begins to reorganize the state. The null state emerged from the need to go beyond traditional manifestation techniques. It was created to help you understand and sustain that internal point of neutrality where effort disappears and reality begins to respond coherently. More than learning something new, it is a process of dismantling the identity that forces, allowing change to happen through alignment rather than tension. It isn't mandatory. It is for those who feel it makes sense, as a natural continuation of this internal investigation. The link is in the pinned comment. If something in this reasoning touched something you already felt but hadn't found the words to name, comment below with your name and one single word. The word that represents the state you want to access, or what you perceived in this video. Could be clarity, could be neutrality, could be coherence, could be surrender, could be observation. One word. Because sometimes naming something with precision is the first act of someone who stopped running and started seeing. Daniel is here and keeps observing.